Welcome, and settle in. Tonight, we're re-traveling far back, further than most written memory dares to reach, to the banks of the Nile, where one of humanity's most mesmerizing civilizations rose and endured for thousands of years. You've heard about pyramids, golden masks, and mighty pharaohs, but what about the brickmaker hauling wet clay in the blazing sun? The temple scribe hunched over a scroll for the fifth hour, or the quiet nights where crocodiles drifted by like ghosts in the reeds? A civilization both magnificent and deeply human. The drone of temple chants, the hum of flies in a marketplace, and the eternal rhythm of the Nile. This is the real Egypt, not just the one of monuments and gods, but one of sweat, ritual, routine, and quiet survival. Across 20 segments you'll gently drift through the sounds and scents of that distant world. The heat rising off mud brick homes. Let's begin. Not with the pharaoh, but with someone whose hands built the very foundations of Egypt's grandeur. Mud, labor, and endless quotas. Imagine yourself barefoot in the damp clay along the river's edge. You don't even get to decide how your day unfolds. The mix is heavy, thick, and sticky. You press it into wooden molds, tapping it flat with calloused fingers. Your feet sink into the hot, soft ground, over and over. You work through the dull ache in your shoulders, the grinding pain in your lower back. Other workers around you murmur curses to the guards, mostly under their breath. The smell of wet earth, manure, and sweat is constant. You're covered in filth, your arms are shaking, but no one complains aloud, because tomorrow it begins again and again. Flies gather. Sometimes the clay pits become quicksand-like, swallowing a foot or even a whole leg. Pulling yourself free leaves you trembling. You drink sparingly. Water's life, but so is your labor. And the taskmaster doesn't favor idle. Then you tip the molds out, one by one, in careful rows, baking under the unforgiving sun. It rarely strikes, but the threat is always there, more exhausting than violence itself. You think of dinner, lentils, perhaps onions, and coarse barley bread if you're lucky. Always more water, but your labor, your back, your fingers, your sweat, keeps temples rising and walls standing. It's early morning, but already warm. The kind of warmth that seeps into your linen tunic and clings to your skin like another layer. You're a brickmaker. You don't write your name. You don't own land. Your muscles throb with fatigue, but at least the night is still, and the wind off the river cools your face. Not glorious, not remembered, but without your hands, none of Egypt's greatness would stand. Your day begins before the sun crests the eastern horizon. The foreman, lian and sharpied, carries a ledger, a tally of what must be produced by sundown quotas. The clay must be gathered by hand, scooped from the wet edges of the Nile and mixed with chopped straw or reeds. There's no shade, no break room, no clean water other than what you carry in a gourd slung from your waist. The mud cracks on your hands by midday. It dries into your fingernails and sticks between your toes. The sun overhead seems indifferent to your labor. At the edge of the site, a low-ranking overseer watches, a reed switch in hand. Sometimes you hum while you work, rhythmic, calming songs, old songs passed from father to son, help keep your pace steady. By evening, the brick rows stretch long like a brown, sun-cracked quilt. The quota is met. Barely, you sleep on a mat near the kill, under the stars. This is your life. Let us leave the smoke-stained rooftops now and descend into the quiet stillness of a northern English cottage in the 1860s. The air is close. A kettle simmers gently on the hearth. A mother hums softly to herself while folding clothes in the fading afternoon light. Everything seems ordinary, but beneath the surface, behind the lace curtains and teacups, something darker brews. Born in 1832 in County Durham, she grew up during a time when loss was common. Childhood illnesses, poor sanitation, dangerous jobs, death was a frequent visitor. But for Marianne, its visits were oddly convenient, tasteless, and odorless. It mimicked the symptoms of common stomach ailments: vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions. A skilled poisoner could mask their crime with just the right dosage, letting the illness linger until it seemed natural. This is the story of Marianne Cotton, a woman who wore black not for fashion, but for funerals, again and again. A woman who seemed to have incredibly bad luck, losing 3 husbands, 11 of her 13 children, and several close relatives over the years. The cause of death, always something like gastric fever, something painful, but common. Pale, composed, and quiet. She claimed innocence even as the evidence mounted, but the implication was chilling. She may have poisoned as many as 21 people, but the testimonies of friends, doctors, neighbors formed a haunting pattern too precise to ignore. An investigation began. Bodies were arsenic was found, something that wouldn't draw too much suspicion in Victorian England. The executioner made a mistake. The drop was too shortened. Mary Ann's death was slow and agonizing, much like those she'd orchestrated. And poison, quiet, subtle, untraceable, became a fear whispered about in every town. Mary Ann lived a life shadowed by death. It's how ordinary she seemed. A woman who made soup, sang lullabies, and carried the scent of camphor and starch, who washed the linens and helped neighbors, who walked children to school, then walked them to their graves. She was a nurse, a wife, a mother. At first, you see, arsenic was easy to find then, sold openly in shops, often used to kill rats or whiten the skin. Mary Ann understood this, and quietly, methodically, she began to use it. Her motives, likely a mix of desperation and calculation. She often collected life insurance payments, small ones, enough to help her move house, start anew, marry again. But each marriage brought new hardship, more mouths to feed, and more perceived obstacles to a peaceful life. The pattern became clearer only after decades. Suspicion finally stirred when a local parish official became concerned over the sudden death of one of her last children and a rapid burial that followed. The headlines screamed across England. The Black Widow, the most notorious woman in Britain. Her trial drew crowds, yet Mary Ann remained eerily calm. In 1873, she was convicted for the murder of her stepson. Just one charge. She was hanged in Durham prison on a cold March morning. Her story left a scar on Victorian society. Women, especially widows, were often viewed through lenses of pity or suspicion after that. But what haunts people most is not the number of deaths. Mary Ann Cotton wasn't a shadowy stranger in the dark. She was in your neighborhood, in your parish, on your street, and for decades, no one noticed. Parliament fled the smell. Close your eyes, if you like, and imagine the scent of summer on the breeze, sun-warmed stone, rose gardens in bloom, and human waste everywhere. It's the summer of 1858, and London is wilting under an unusual heatwave. The River Thames, London's main artery, lifeline, and dumping ground, has turned a sickly brown. This is literal. It is the Great Stink, and it brought the mighty city of London to its knees. Its surface gleams with oily scum. Dead fish float belly up. The water moves sluggishly, weighed down by the Victorian sewer system was, at this point, not much of a system at all. Most homes still used chamber pots and waste was collected in the middle of the night by night soil men, a thankless foul-smelling trade. In wealthier neighborhoods, you might have indoor plumbing, which simply dumped straight into the Thames. This is not the metaphorical rot of empire or morality. Others were more poetic. It is the death of air. Visitors fainted on bridges. Rowers took ill mid-stroke. Lime was poured into drains, and scent dispensers were installed, but nothing helped. The stink was total. Joseph Bazalgette, a quiet, methodical civil engineer with a fondness for order and drainage. What followed was a feat of engineering brilliance. Over 1,100 miles of brick-lined sewers, massive pumping stations, and embankments that reshaped the river itself. Curtains soaked in vinegar were hung at windows in a futile attempt to block the miasma. To understand it, we must first understand what lies beneath. Children played along fetid canals, unaware of the danger. Rain fell, but that summer, the defining element was something far more primal, a smell so powerful, it rewrote the city's future. The river stirred, a quiet triumph born from a moment of unbearable discomfort. But the memory lingered, pungent and unforgettable. And the medical profession remained divided. Some believed the smell itself was what caused illness, while others suspected tiny, invisible agents. That meant millions of daily flushes, bucket dumps, and waste barrels, much of it ending up in the same place. Temperatures rose, water levels dropped, bacteria bloomed, the river's contents turned stagnant, and the smell ... And the Thames, beloved river, symbol of the empire, was drowning in it. By 1858, London's population had ballooned to over 2.5 million people. In June of that year, the sun bore down relentlessly. Newspapers described it as a fearful and intolerable nuisance. Even the mighty Houses of Parliament, perched picturesquely along the riverbank, were overwhelmed. Lawmakers attempted to conduct business as usual, but within days, the stench had seeped through the walls. Rising from grates and water pipes, curling under doors like a living thing. Desperate measures were tried. Sheets soaked in carbolic acid were draped over windows. Only then did Parliament move swiftly to support a plan it had previously stalled for years: a comprehensive overhaul of London's sanitation. The hero of the hour, he was granted unprecedented funding, over £3 million, an enormous sum at the time, and set to work. But in the summer of 1858, that victory was still a blueprint. In the moment, there was only the smell. Citizens trudged to work with handkerchiefs over their mouths. Visitors fled the city. In time, the great stink would pass. Today, when we think of Victorian London, we often imagine fog, smoke, and gaslight. And beneath modern London, basil jets. Tunnels still flow silently, still in use. Gloves, courtships, and curtsies. Now, let us take a step away from the grime and soot of the streets and rise just a little into another world. The world of the Victorian debutante, where silks swished, lace rustled softly, and reputations were everything. Imagine yourself waking in a bed of embroidered linens, in a bedroom that smells faintly of rosewater and lavender. You are not porno. Your family is of a respectable class, though perhaps not especially wealthy. And you, at 17 or 18 years of age, are preparing for what society calls your coming out. Your figure must be trim. Layers of petticoats follow. Then the dress, a delicate construction of taffeta and netting, often pale in color to suggest youth and purity. Gloves are non-negotiable. A hat or bonnet, yes, depending on the time of day. This is the season, a months-long whirl of balls, garden parties, luncheons, and carriage rides, designed for one purpose: to find you a suitable husband. Your day begins not with leisure, but with expectation. A maid helps you into your corset tight, but not too tight. The butler announces a caller, a young gentleman, perhaps, who met you last week at Lady Ash. He stays only 10 minutes. Anything longer would be unseemly. You nod to acquaintances, smile, keep your posture just so. Any inappropriate behavior, a hand to low on your waist. A conversation that veers toward flirtation, and your mother will notice. So will others. You may not speak to him alone. You may not write him a letter. Every step is watched. You take tea in the drawing room with your mother. She reminds you to speak modestly, to avoid controversial topics, and above all to be pleasant, but not eager. At 11, your dance card arrives for the evening's ball. Others are frightened. A few are simply bored. You nod, you dance, you smile. A porcelain figure in a game you didn't invent. A match with a gentleman of title, even. A minor one can change a family's fortunes. But one slip of the tongue, one overheard comment, and a girl's reputation might sour overnight. The ballroom is bright, with candlelight reflecting off mirrors. Musicians tune their instruments. You curtsy, perfectly measured, and wait. Later in the afternoon, there may be a visit to Hyde Park, in a slow-turning carriage that displays your elegance to all the other eligible families. You're escorted out into the foggy London air, cheeks flushed not from affection, but from exertion and nerves. Your hair is arranged in glossy rings, but with each passing season, expectations shift. Soon you will be labeled a spinster, even at 20. The maid laces your evening gown tighter than before, a string of pearls at the neck, gloves again, and a tiny fan. Back home, preparations begin. Then the ball. You enter with your mother, who will chaperone you all night. Your dance card fills slowly. Each gentleman you accept will take your hand, dance once or twice, then leave you at the edge of the floor with a bow. If a man asks for more than 2 dancers, it is assumed he is courting you. Beneath the surface, the season is less about romance than strategy. Families maneuver for status, wealth, and suitable alliances. Behind the lace gloves and faint perfume, many debutantes feel a quiet pressure building. Some are excited, and when the season ends, those who haven't found a match may try again next year. Still, for this one night, you move beneath the chandelier. As the ballroom clock chimes midnight, your coach is called. Tomorrow, it begins again. What families endured in slum housing, imagine now the narrow back streets of London's East End or Manchester's Ankh. It is early morning. A greyish light filters through broken window panes, and your breath hangs in the cold air like fog. The smell is thick coal smoke, damp wood, and something sour from the shared privy 2 doors down. You live in what's called a court dwelling, one of many hastily built after industrialization swept across the land like a fever. Water is fetched from a communal pump, but it's often tainted. A shared privy out back, used by dozens, overflows in rainy months. Flies buzz, rats scurry through the walls. These were not homes so much as shelters, thrown up in tight clusters by landlords eager for profit. and largely unchecked by regulation. She sits in the corner, wrapped in rags. There are 6 of you in a single room. Mother, father, 3 children, and a grandmother who rarely speaks since the coughing fits began. The walls are peeling, blackened by coal dust. The floor is bare wood, uneven and cold. There is no indoor plumbing. Your family's meals are cooked on a small grate, if coal can be if a payment is missed, an eviction can come with little warning. Cholera, typhoid, consumption, each name whispered like a curse. When the local doctor does come, he shrugs. He has seen hundreds like you. He leaves behind advice you cannot afford to follow. Furniture may be tossed in the street, possessions sold for food or firewood. Entire families can disappear overnight, swallowed by the system. Somewhere, a neighbor stumbles home drunk from the gin palace. A mother screams in labor. Often, the fire is weak, the room filled with smoke. Songs drift faintly from windows, snatches of ballads sung to babies, or muttered by the elderly. Dinner might be tea with bread, or a stew made from scraps and onion ends. Meat is rare, so is warmth. At night, the sound of coughing from other families through paper-thin walls makes sleep uneasy. Babies cry. Arguments break out, and you rise each day into another version of the same dim survival. The ceilings drip from leaky roofs, and black mold clings to the corners of your world like a second skin. And yet, you endure. The children, if old enough, leave early for work textile mills, coal yards, or match factories. If they're lucky, they earn a few pennies. If they're not, they return with burns, rashes, or injuries they cannot afford to treat. Mother takes in laundry or sewing, hunched over long hours by a window for light. Father might be on shift at a foundry, or laid off again, watching the line outside the workhouse grow. There are no leases, only weekly rent due to the landlord's agent. Disease flourishes in the slums. In the midst of all this, life persists. Children still play in alleyways, hopping over puddles. A neighbor might share soup when she has extra. There is community here, as fragile and stubborn as weeds through brickwork. But the life expectancy is low, and the hope for something better moved to a less crowded street. A second-hand coat that fits often feels like wishful thinking. And so, the dust settles, the coal smoke thickens. Manners hiding misery. It is just past 3 o'clock, and the light filters through tall lace-curtained windows. You find yourself seated on a dainty chair in a parlor that smells faintly of roses and warm scones. The air is quiet but poised. A silver tray glides in. The first pour of the tea waits for the guest begin. Introduced by Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, the custom of tea between lunch and dinner quickly became an essential social ritual for the well-to-do. Place your napkin on your lap. Fold it once before you leave. Eat from the tea tray. In the correct order, savory to sweet. Use lemon, not milk, with Earl Grey. Slum children, barefoot and coughing, might pass by the window, drawn to the scent of baking bread. Downstairs a maid hurried to keep the water hot, her own break hours away if it came at all. And remember, everything, every motion, every phrase must seem effortless. But beneath the lace and the lemon slices, Victorian tea was also a mirror of class, of struggle, of invisible lines drawn in porcelain and sugar. And in the city's many homes, other kinds of labor continue without pause. One such silent yet staggering was the post. A family whose fortunes were faltering might cling to tea as a symbol of refinement. The silver was polished, even if pawned last week and redeemed just this morning. The cakes were sparse, but the tables were laid with crisp linen and tiers of delicate sweets. A place where she might resort full in the eyes of society. A dropped scone or awkward silence might linger longer in memory than the taste of the tea itself. Fine bone china, thin, translucent, and expensive, rested on fragile saucers. And yet behind the gentle clatter of teaspoons, a subtler struggle played out. This is not merely a meal. It is a performance. Afternoon tea in Victorian England was as much about display as it was about refreshment. There were rules. Do not clink your spoon against the cup. Do not never raise your pinky. Imagine the internal tension. For a young woman, the tea table was a proving ground. And yet, all the while, outside the parlor, London's tenements swelled with hunger. It was also, quietly, a stage 4 protest. In later years, suffragettes would use tea as a form of resistance, gathering, organizing, and subtly shifting the conversation, all while balancing a cucumber sandwich on one gloved hand. Even among those enjoying the ritual, appearances often masked reality. Men often took their tea in private clubs or offices, but for women, afternoon tea was a rare domain of control and conversation. There is comfort in ritual. Even today, the notion of tea carries a kind of softness. As the final spoonful of jam is scraped from the silver dish, the light outside begins to dim. The empire moved on. Envelopes. It begins with a soft scrape of a pen, the curl of ink looping across stiff parchment. A love letter, perhaps, or an invoice, or a simple note to mother across the city, folded neatly, tucked into an envelope, and sealed with a practiced press. Then, the steady click of boots on cobblestones as the writer walks it to the nearest postbox, a bright red cylinder, standing like a beacon amid the fog. The time, just past noon. The next collection will be at 12:30. And yes, there will be another at 2, and again at 4. In London, by 1880, a letter posted in the morning might reach its recipient by dinner. Steam trains thundered out from London every hour, mailbags slung into iron compartments. Dedicated mailed trains even sorted letters en route, clerks working by oil lamp inside moving carriages, sliding drawers, stamping envelopes, all as the countryside passed in blur. Others, thin and crumpled, bore desperate pleas from relatives in the workhouse, or news of failure from emigrants abroad. One could both hope and dread the sound of that slot. It was dependable, impartial, and in a society so marked by class, a rare thing shared. It sounds improbable today, and yet it was so. Somewhere, even now, in the cracks of Victorian furniture or between floorboards of long-forgotten homes, they rest, unread, their secrets safe in silence. For the lonely, a glimpse of the world beyond their window. 12, uniformed in navy blue, brass buttons gleaming, they stepped briskly from door to door, calling out, "Post." As they dropped missives through the slot, the sound of the mail slot clattering open became as much a fixture of daily life as the church bell or factory horn. Their tools were stamps, satchels, and timepieces. Their reward, efficiency, pride, and often very little sleep. And for a penny a single copper coin you could send a letter nearly anywhere in the kingdom. The Victorian postal system was a marvel of quiet precision. In cities, postmen made as many as 12 deliveries per day. Imagine the rhythm of a home interrupted by such regular news. A telegram from India, a bill from the tailor. Children adored the postman, some even believed he was related to Santa Claus. For older folk, he was a lifeline. But not all letters brought joy. Some carried news of death, disease, or debt. Behind this elegant system were thousands of workers, postal clerks, railway sorters, runners, night staff each, governed by meticulous schedules and quiet discipline. By 1880, the postal service had become one of the few institutions trusted by rich and poor alike. And still, some letters never arrived, lost in rain, torn in sorting, or simply misplaced. But before the silence could settle too deeply, another door might open, not to a postman this time, but to an orderly, not with letters, but with questions. Come now, gently, as we step into segment 10. Inside a Victorian asylum. Diagnosis, you said, where the mind was feared more than understood. The gate creaks shut behind you, iron bars, damp stone. A hushed corridor lined with doors, behind each one a story sometimes tragic, sometimes strange, sometimes simply misunderstood. Welcome to the Victorian asylum. Here, the definition of madness was broad and frighteningly flexible. In a world where women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and always composed, the boundary between eccentricity and insanity was perilously thin. Hysteria was a favorite diagnosis, derived from the Greek word for youth. It became a convenient label for nearly any female behavior that disrupted the expected order. Silence encouraged, then demanded. Grief that lingered too long, anger expressed too openly, refusal to marry, refusal to remain married. But the overwhelming scrutiny on women's behavior meant they entered in higher numbers, and sometimes never left. Even reading too many novels or writing too many poems could draw suspicion. Asylums kept precise records. Casebooks, filled with neat handwriting, describing patients in chilling clinical terms. Melancholia, moral insanity, religious excitement. These, too, were part of Victorian life, part of the undercurrent of resistance. Quiet, but as we move on from the asylums and the echo of misdiagnosed minds, we find ourselves in a very different space. Less eerie, more structured, though no less strange. Others faded into the rhythm of institutional life, days blending into one another, identities slipping away like the sound of their own name. Others were grim, underfunded places where patients wandered aimlessly or were strapped to chairs for hours. You could find yourself here not for violence, but for sadness, not for danger, but for nonconformity. Inside the asylum, the rules were unyielding. Patients, men and women, both woke at dawn. Beds were made with military precision. Meals served without flourish. Some facilities were well-meaning, with orderly gardens and compassionate nurses. There were treatments, of course. Cold baths, electrotherapy, bleeding, isolation. The logic behind them varied, but the message was often the same. Be quiet, return to normal, whatever that meant. Men were institutionalized too often for alcoholism, delusions, or trauma from the horrors of factory work or war. Some patients improved, or appeared to. Still, even in this place, the Victorian obsession with order was present, and sometimes just a single word. Incorrigible. Yet within these walls, despite the constraints, small acts of rebellion flickered. Letters smuggled out, poetry scratched into walls, flowers grown in forbidden corners. Now, the corridors fall quiet again. Footsteps echo and fade. The padded doors remain shut. Let us now return to the bustling heart of London, to a world of whispers and lace gloves, where appearances hid everything. Silent, watchful, and endlessly busy. Imagine waking before dawn every day, not to greet the sunlight, but to beat it. You dress in silence, wash in cold water, and descend narrow steps into the belly of a townhouse, or perhaps a sprawling country estate. On the other, it demanded the surrender of personal freedom, privacy, and sometimes even identity. You were not Sarah, but the scullery maid. You were not a person, but a role. Welcome to the servants' quarters, where entire lives played out in hushed tones, and status was measured in staircase steps. A thick stew, a heel of bread, occasionally pudding, if it was a good day and the cook was feeling generous. Victorian domestic service was a world of On the one hand, it offered steady employment, room and board, and a kind of security rare in slum life. Chamber pots, so many chamber pots had to be emptied discreetly. A household staff could become a kind of strange family, bonded by the rhythm of their labor, the unspoken understanding that they were the unseen hands behind someone else's comfort. You moved like a shadow, ensuring everything appeared seamless and untouched. They retreated to their cramped attic quarters or basement bunks, exhausted and largely forgotten by the family they served. A lucky few might resign under butler, becoming a butler, a scullery maid becoming a cook, but most remained, year after year, cleaning grates and polishing brass, aging quietly in rooms no guest ever saw. Hierarchy reigned here just as it did upstairs. It is early morning, and a pale, yellow-gray light barely filters through the thick fog. The air is damp, not just from the weather but from everything that clings to it: soot, coal smoke, the stench of manure, and the oily haze of gas lamps. The butler was king below stairs, managing the wine cellar and the household accounts. It crept through alleyways and clung to windows, thickening with each breath you took. The term pea super was on poetic Londoness. Fogs could be dense enough to blot out gas lamps and force carriages to stop for fear of collision. The housekeeper's stern, street crime soared, as visibility dropped to just inches, and for those with respiratory ailments, the smog was not just unpleasant, it could be deadly. Below them were ranks of maids, footmen, kitchen boys, and errand girls. Each had a title, each had a place, and with so many people living so close together, the streets became the extension of their homes. Washing hung overhead. Toddlers toddled barefoot. The cities could never quite keep up with the growth of their own populations, and so the grime remained. Boots were never clean, hems were never dry, the smell never quite faded, and vendors sold jellied eels, pies, or boiled sweets from wooden carts. There were no quiet moments in the city's core. Even at night, you could hear the rattle of wheels, the hiss of gas jets, and the creak of shutters, opening and closing in the dark. A servant dismissed without a character, that is, without a written reference him to find it impossible to be hired again. One mistake could end a livelihood. People made their way through it, lifting their skirts, pulling their coats tighter, turning up their collars against the cold or the stench, because they had to. Work began before the family stirred. Fires needed laying, boots needed blackening. The cobblestones are slick from rain or worse. And what is that, worse? Horse droppings. Endless heaps of them. Those who could afford it hired crossing sweepers, often impoverished children, or, for a penny or two, would clear a small patch of road with a broom so you could step more daintily. In a city of hundreds of thousands of horses pulling cabs, carts, omnibuses, and carriages, the daily production of manure ran into hundreds of tons, a place of solemnity, poverty, and strange rituals of the past. A stolen moment on the back step with tea and fresh air. Christmas Day brought a little revelry, perhaps, a meat pie, and a single glass of port, followed by servants' own celebrations after the family's feast concluded. Meals for the family might be served with silver and crystal upstairs, but for the servants, they were plain and precisely timed. Discipline was everything. Lateness, backtalk, or even an untidy appearance could result in dismissal. And yet, there were small joys, a laugh shared in the stillness of the kitchen. There was also camaraderie. Some servants spent decades in the same household. Others moved from place to place, following opportunity or fleeing disgrace. As night fell, servants were expected to vanish again, silent, invisible. The next morning they'd do it all again. Now as the household quiets for the night, and the coals in the kitchen hearth burn low, we take a final look at the soot and sorrow that lingered in the very walls of these homes, where your boots never came clean, and the sun was rarely seen. Imagine, for a moment, stepping out of your cramped flat into the streets of 1870s London. Your first obstacle is the road itself. There are no sidewalks to speak of in some quarters, and where there are, they are cracked or crowded. Crossing the street meant wading through the mix of dung, mud, and straw sludge that clung to hems and boots alike. And then, the fog, not a gentle mist, but a choking, yellow smog, born of coal fires, factory chimneys, and millions of hearths. During the worst fogs, people stumbled into the Thames by accident. Noise was constant, horses' hooves clattering, costermongers shouting their wares, beggars pleading, children laughing or crying. In the poorer districts, open sewers ran alongside dwellings. Drainage was primitive. Sanitation was improving by the end of the 19th century, but slowly, in the rain, it was worse. In the heat, unbearable. And yet, life marched on. As you retreat from this scene, wrinkling your nose at the damp air and eyeing the dubious puddle at your feet, now stepping into something much quieter, much more hidden, when grief met ritual, even without a penny to spare. In the flickering grey of a gaslit alley, where damp clothes hung above the cobbles and the soot clung to every sill, death did not arrive with pomp or fanfare. It came quietly, often suddenly, and was followed by an almost sacred routine even among the poorest of families. The Victorians were obsessed with death. From Queen Victoria's lifelong mourning for Prince Albert to the mass-produced black crepe available in every shop window, death was not hidden away but integrated into the rhythm of life. Mourning became a culture, complete with rules, expectations, and codes of conduct. But what happened when you couldn't afford to mourn? In a slum tenement, where 10 people might share 2 rooms, and coal dust darkened even the daylight, the death of a family member brought both sorrow and fear. The cost of burial was more than most could dream of. A simple wooden coffin, a carriage to the cemetery, the purchase of a burial plot all required money. These were held at odd hours, often unannounced, with little ceremony. Mass graves were used, and the names of the dead were sometimes never recorded. But for those who could, any semblance of ritual was clung to. It gave death dignity. It gave the living closure, money that might otherwise have fed children or paid for rent. The city's noise softened in the face of death. Children watched from doorways. Women wept quietly. Men removed their hats. Still, families did what they could. Some pawned their few possessions, rings, shawls, watches to afford even the barest ceremony. To the factory, to the laundry, to the crowded rooms and thin soup. But something lingered. The dead were gone, but not forgotten. Others pooled money with neighbors or joined burial clubs, paying in small weekly installments in the hope that, when the time came, they wouldn't face shame. In the slums of Whitechapel or Spitalfields, police officers were often seen as tools of the upper class enforcers of laws that protected the rich, not the poor. A thief might be cornered and beaten by locals before any constable arrived. In tight-knit communities, disputes were resolved through gossip, threats, or quiet retaliation. Their arrival could mean eviction, arrest, or worse. Coins were placed on the eyes to keep them closed. Children were warned to behave lest the constable come knocking. Women sometimes avoided reporting abuse for fear of scandal or dismissal. And in the courts, accents, appearances, and addresses could influence outcomes more than facts. The presence of law could mean protection or punishment. Somewhere in the shadows, a scuffle breaks out, a raised voice, the crash of a bottle, perhaps a muffled cry, but as burdens to be managed. But these were exceptions. The officer might listen. He might scribble a few notes, but response times were slow, and evidence gathering was rudimentary at best. And then, silence. If you were there, crouched beneath a window or huddled beneath a shawl, you might wonder, should someone call for help? Holding cells were cramped and filthy. Trials could be little more than formalities. Petty crimes, stealing bread, damaging property, even loitering could result in hard labor or transportation to distant colonies. The workhouse loomed for the destitute, the prison cell for the desperate. Before that, there were watchmen, parish constables, and the occasional private enforcer hired by the wealthy. Police officers were increasingly trained and held to standards. Specialized units, like the detective branch, emerged. Famous case is the Whitechapel murders. For example, forced authorities to reconsider how justice was served in the labyrinth of urban poverty. But these figures were inconsistent, often corrupt, and rarely ventured deep into the poorest neighborhoods, unless dragged there. A black ribbon, a crepe armband. For women, perhaps a dyed shawl or veil. In fact, for much of the early 19th century, it was a gesture steeped in hesitation and fear. The Victorians measured grief in time. Widows were expected to mourn for 2 years, though few in the slums could afford such sartorial displays. Curtains were drawn, mirrors were covered, a nod to old superstitions about spirits becoming trapped. Wakes were common, even in one-room homes. The body would be laid out sometimes in a simple box, sometimes on a table or bed covered in a white sheet or mourning clothing, even for the poor, was worn when possible. Children's funerals were heartbreakingly common. In the city's poorer districts, child mortality was high. Disease, hunger, and cold claimed many. And yet, even the smallest coffins were accompanied by tears and quiet processions. A neighbor might lend a mourning cart. A priest might offer a prayer, even if the family could give no offering in return. Funerals for the destitute, the so-called paupers' burials, were administered by the state. As the black horses clopped toward the cemetery, the mourners walked behind, heads bowed, scarves pulled tight against the wind. And when the burial was over, when the grave was filled, the flowers placed, and the prayers said those left behind returned to life. The rituals, no matter how modest, had given shape to grief. And now, from the somber path of funerals, we step into the realm of law and order, or its illusion in the next segment, when the night watchman's lantern flickered, and authority was still learning how to behave. Imagine a narrow London street, late at night. The lamps sputtered dimly in the fog, but in Victorian London, calling the police was not always a guarantee of protection. The modern British police force was still new, its blue-coated officers first introduced in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, hence the nickname Bobbies. The Metropolitan Police promised professionalism, but in the early decades, trust was hard-won. When a crime occurred, say, a theft, an assault, or a case of domestic violence, neighbors might handle it themselves. Street justice was common, but sometimes, someone did run for help. They might race to the local station or find a beat officer identified by his polished boots, truncheon, and stovepipe hat. For those arrested, the journey through the justice system was swift and often brutal. And yet, as the century wore on, things began to change, but the poor remained wary. For many, the police were not a source of safety, but an extension of surveillance and control. Still, there were moments of compassion. Officers who knew their beat, while might quietly help a hungry child or intervene in a family dispute with patience rather than force. So, when the rattle of a truncheon echoed through the alley, or a sharp whistle pierced the fog, hearts did not always lift. Now, let's leave the patrolman behind and step into a very different kind of institution, where the poor were treated not as citizens. Clockwork, cruelty, grey uniforms, and the slow erasure of the self. If the streets of the Victorian slums were bleak, the workhouse was colder still, not in temperature alone, but in spirit. Imagine walking through tall iron gates, the sound of your own footsteps echoing in a wide, colorless corridor. The walls are bare, the air still. You've come here not to be helped, but to be managed. Workhouses were the backbone of the 19th century. Poor laws designed not so much to uplift the destitute as to discourage poverty by making it as unpleasant as possible. Less eligibility was the phrase of the day. Conditions in the workhouse must always be worse than those of the poorest laborer outside, lest idleness take root. Families were separated by gender and age. Husbands from wives, mothers from children. You received a coursed uniform, often striped or plain grey, and a number. Names faded into the bureaucratic silence. Women scrubbed floors, washed linen, or sewed for hours, with poor lighting and aching backs. Children, even as young as 5, might assist in laundry rooms or sort rags under the eyes of overseers. Others were worn down by bureaucracy, performing their duties with quiet resignation. But kindness was rare and hope rarer still. Once admitted, you were stripped not just of your clothes, but of your identity. But the sermons often emphasized sin, debt, and obedience, not comfort. No warmth, no softness, no escape. In its cold logic, it transformed human struggle into data, labor into control, and hope into memory. Religion, like everything else in the workhouse, was meant to reform, not to soothe. The routine was rigid. Medical schools were booming. Anatomy was gaining ground as a vital part of a doctor's education, and cadavers were in woefully short supply. The government allowed only the bodies of executed criminals to be dissected legally, but executions were fewer, and classrooms were crowded. Under the cover of night, they'd target freshly buried bodies, digging fast and deep before the soil had settled. Once retrieved, the body would be rushed to a willing surgeon or anatomist. Payment exchanged in candlelit rooms, questions avoided. Iron cages called morgue safes were installed over graves. Some hired guards to watch plots for the first few nights. Others buried their dead under concrete or placed flowers in certain arrangements to detect disturbance. The infamous Burke and Hare murders in Edinburgh, a few decades earlier, where living victims were smothered for selling guard in the public memory, even if technically a different crime. Coffins were breached, lids pried open, and the remains removed, sometimes fully clothed, sometimes stripped on site, with clothing returned to the coffin to delay discovery. As with much in Victorian society, the poorest were the most vulnerable even in death. In a way, the stolen dead live on in every textbook, every scalpel, every surgical miracle. The sick ward held its own share of silence, its own share of final exit. It allowed unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals to be legally used for science, shifting the burden but not necessarily ending the moral dilemma. The act passed. The resurrectionists faded, but their legacy remained beneath the surface. Many entered the workhouse in desperation, Many died within its walls, unmarked and unremembered. A place where hair of all things told a tale. Wake at dawn, to die in one was worse shame, clung to the name in records, whispered long after death. Some came with sacks and shovels, timing their work between the passers of watchmen and the yawns of exhausted guards. These were the resurrectionists' men who dealt not in death, but in what came after it. Even Charles Dickens, though often romanticized today, portrayed the workhouse in Oliver Twist not as a sanctuary, but as a punishment. A chunk of bread, maybe some boiled potatoes, once a week, perhaps a sliver of meat. Talking during meals, forbidden. Complaints, dangerous. Punishment could be swift solitary confinement, bread and water diets, or extra work shifts. Roll call, gruel for breakfast, often a weak oatmeal or watered-down broth. Then labor, endless, grinding, thankless labor. Men broke stones into gravel or picked oak mold, shipped rope apart with bleeding fingers. Meals were sparse. Healthcare, if it could be called that, was basic and often dismissive. To be born in the workhouse was a grim fate, yet these places were not always filled with villains. Some staff genuinely believed in the redemptive power of discipline. Occasionally you might glimpse a chapel where hymns echoed off stone walls in the evenings. Imagine lying on a thin mattress after 12 hours of labor, the clang of the dinner bell still ringing faintly in your ears, knowing tomorrow would bring the same. The workhouse did not just house the poor, it erased them. Let us leave the echoing corridors behind now and enter the shadows of a Victorian street where whispers of the supernatural still linger. Graveyards watched, corpses stolen, and knowledge bought with silence. In the stillness of a foggy London night, not every figure moving through the graveyard came to mourn. You see, in the Victorian era, science was hungry, so demand created a shadow market. The resurrectionists were often laborers, slum dwellers, themselves those with strong backs, silent mouths, and little to lose. There was a chilling efficiency to it. The corpse wasn't stolen for any personal motive, no ritual, no spite. It was simply a commodity, flesh turned into curriculum. Grave robbing wasn't exactly murder, but it wasn't far from it in the eyes of the public. Families began to take extreme measures, and yet the practice thrived in the gaps. In poorer neighborhoods, where burials were more hasty and graves shallow, the risks were lower and the resistance less organized. Occasionally, things turned darker. Some resurrectionists crossed the line, not waiting for death to occur naturally. Eventually, the 1832 Anatomy Act sought to quell the practice. The surgeons who studied those bodies, whether knowingly complicit or willfully ignorant, became the pioneers of modern medicine. So, the next time you imagine a medical breakthrough in Victorian England, remember the night, the shovel, and the quiet footsteps in a graveyard. Now, let us leave the shadows of science and walk into something lighter, though no less peculiar. Locks of hair, braided brooches, and grief turned into wearable memory. Imagine yourself standing in a quiet Victorian parlor. The drapes are drawn, the clocks are stopped, mirrors are turned toward the wall, and the room is heavy with silence. A photograph of the departed rests on the mantel, and beside it, a small, curious objector ring, a brooch, or a necklace, glinting dully in the gaslight. Human hair, intricately worked into jewelry, sometimes coiled beneath glass, other times woven into delicate patterns like lace or embroidery. This was mourning jewelry, a fashion both morbid and deeply tender, that flourished in the Victorian era. But what catches your eye isn't the gold or silver, it's what lies within. A curl of chestnut brown, a braid of pale blonde. Some rings bore the word Mizpah, a Hebrew blessing, often translated as, "The Lord watch between me and thee," when we are absent one from another, passed from mother to daughter, kept in little velvet-lined boxes, or hidden at the bottom of sewing drawers. Long after the wearer had ceased to weep, the token remained, a whisper of someone once held dear. Others simply said in memory of a bridge between the living and the dead, a way of holding on just a little longer. Now imagine that capsule disappearing with a soft whoosh into the wall, like a message being inhaled by the very city itself. The humming, clicking, and clattering system that made the Victorian post a marvel. It lingered, untarnished by time, long after the body had gone cold, and for the grieving, that permanence was a comfort. A widow might clip a lock from her husband's temple before the coffin was closed. Mothers snipped curls from the heads of lost children. These tubes didn't carry people, but messages. A post clerk would insert the message capsule, close the chamber, and then, hiss, it was gone. A few minutes later, The recipient on the other end would hear a thud as the capsule arrived. It must have felt a bit like magic. Small canisters filled with mail zipped through the tunnels at up to 30 miles per hour, rattling through turns and curves, arriving moments later at their destination. But nowhere did it blend so neatly into the dual nature of the Victorian world where innovation and grime existed side by side. Entire networks had to be shut down for repairs. But when it worked, it was glorious, a modern marvel humming beneath the old city. As we step into the shadows of the next segment, prepare to meet the quiet sorrow of the Victorian asylum. Above ground, gas lamps, horse dung, and soot. Below ground, pneumatic speed and mechanical precision. The strands would be washed, dried, and sent to a jeweler or, fashioned at home by skilled hands, into bracelets, earrings, or even elaborate wreaths that adorned the wall. Hair, you see, was seen as more than just a physical remnant. Unlike flesh or bone, it resisted decay. But in their heyday, they were a wonder, a symbol of ambition, of a city trying to move faster than the century it lived in. Letters flew between homes, shops, banks, and government offices at astonishing rates. The Royal Mail worked tirelessly above ground, but deep below, something more experimental was underway. Crafting these keepsakes became an act of mourning in itself. Mourning jewelry could be extravagant, crafted in gold, with diamonds and pearls, but it was also common among the middle class, especially as mass production allowed for more affordable keepsakes, and business papers faster than any horse or human could manage. The tubes connected places like the Central Telegraph Office to the Stock Exchange and Parliament, offering near-instant delivery at least by Victorian standards. In many cases, the hair was combined with initials, dates, or tiny portrait miniatures. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, she plunged the nation into mourning alongside her own grief. She wore black for the rest of her life. She also kept his hair in lockets and rings, setting a fashion that the public followed for decades. And this wasn't confined to the elite. For Queen Victoria, this tradition became personal and defining. But perhaps most touching was how these tokens moved through time. Today, when we find these artifacts in antique shops or museum drawers, it can feel eerie. But to the Victorians, this was love materialized. And now, from the quiet intimacy of grief, we turn to something altogether more public and surprisingly efficient. Messages shot through the veins of London like breath through a pipe. Imagine a letter, small, neatly folded, slipped into a narrow brass capsule, beneath the cobblestone streets and soot-darkened buildings of Victorian London. A strange and futuristic network pulsed quietly. The pneumatic post. It was the 1860s, and the city was booming both in population and correspondence. Pneumatic tubes powered by compressed air snaked their way under London like metal arteries. The system was surprisingly extensive. By the 1870s, major London post offices were linked via underground tube, sending telegrams, urgent letters. Each station had a receiving box, a series of valves, and a network of air compressors, some powered by steam, others by massive bellows. Sometimes, the system misfired. Capsules got stuck. Messages went astray. For Londoners of the time, this was just one more contradiction in their world. The tubes weren't just in London, either. Paris and New York had their own systems. In time, the tubes would fade, replaced by telephones, automobiles, and eventually email. And from this speeding world of messages, we now descend again into places where silence reigned, though not by choice. Whispers behind high stone walls, diagnoses drawn from silence. Imagine a tall brick building on the edge of town, its iron gates creaking in the wind. Ivy creeps slowly up its outer walls. Behind its windows, many of them barred, are the quiet shapes of people watching the world move without them. Not a place of healing as we might imagine today, but a warehouse of the misunderstood, the inconvenient, and the forgotten. This was the Victorian asylum. 2 signatures were often all it took. For women, it might be grief that lasted too long. Those considered dangerous or unpredictable were confined to locked rooms, often in solitary silence. Others wandered long, dim hallways in a haze of laudanum or opium, or anger that came too quickly, or simply refusing to marry. And perhaps most chillingly, isolation. The removal of stimulus, of voices, of choice. The term placed blame on the womb, reinforcing the view that female emotion was pathology. A woman challenging her husband's decisions, mad, a woman mourning too loudly, dangerous. Some found in the asylum a strange kind of safety, a rhythm of days free from the pressures of poverty or a hostile home. A man might end up in an asylum for melancholy or simply because his family could no longer support him. To be labeled mad in the 19th century could mean many things. A place of silence, of misunderstood souls. There were reformers, physicians, and nurses who believed that work, fresh air, and routine could help calm troubled minds. Some patients worked in gardens, others stitched linen or helped in the kitchen. There were reading rooms, even dancers in some institutions. The line between mental illness and eccentricity was and the power to institutionalize someone rested in the hands of relatives, employers, or doctors. Once inside, the world narrowed. Wards were segregated by gender and diagnosis. The treatments were, at best, primitive. Cold baths to shock the patient into normalcy, rotating chair spun rapidly to reset the senses, or a peep into a mutoscope, an early motion picture device, flickering, silent images of dancers, boxers, or exotic lands, looping endlessly on a crank. Yet not all asylums were pure cruelty. Perhaps a glimpse into your future love life, or the faint warning of misfortune. The answers were vague, the machinery stiff, but the mystery was delicious. And when your hand finally closed around one of those warm, slightly grimy coins, you knew exactly where to go. Others offered diorama-style clockwork scenes behind curved glass, trains puffing across miniature bridges, battleships rocking on mechanical waves, or dancers twirling in eternal pirouette. They were shrines to simple delight, humming with mechanical life. Many of these machines were built cheaply, maintained poorly, and stacked close together in poorly lit rooms. The air grew hot, the machines often jammed, and the money slots had a way of swallowing pennies without mercy. The air was tinged with oil and brass, and the wooden floors echoed with footsteps and bursts of laughter. Everything in here clattered or buzzed or whirred, but the shadow of neglect was always near. Overcrowding swelled the wards. Underfunding stretched caretakers thin. Maybe your fortune told you love was coming. Maybe you beat the strongman machine. Maybe, for just a few minutes, you had the power to choose. Restraints both physical and chemical were common, and for many, once admitted, there was no leaving, especially for women. Hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis, could encompass anything from anxiety to menopause. Children were sometimes institutionalized too, for behaviors now associated with autism or ADHD. Others simply had nowhere else to go. Despite all this, some patients did improve, some left, and when the walls closed in too tightly, when the days became indistinguishable, many patients turned inward to drawing, to muttering prayers, to pacing, finding private patterns of peace in a world that had stopped listening. The asylum stands today in old photographs and faint medical records, and as we step from its cold halls back into the bustling streets of the city, the contrast is jarring. For now, let us pause and breathe before we move on to a lighter topic. The unexpected joys of a penny arcade, and the noisy fun that helps some Londoners forget, if only for a while. Mechanical laughter, flickering lights, and music boxes masking the grind beneath. In the shadow of factories and gas lamps, where soot fell softly like a second skin, the penny arcade glowed like a carnival in miniature, bright, noisy, and wonderfully absurd. But save it you did perhaps from running errands, or sweeping a shop floor. Arcades popped up in shop fronts, seaside piers, and railway stations. What could a penny buy? Perhaps a turn on a strength test or a giant laver that dared you to prove your might. There were fortune-telling automaton women behind glass, who waved tiny hands and spat out printed cards. Music machines played chirping tunes through cracked horns. Some arcades featured early versions of pinball or bagatelle, with balls cascading through mazes of pegs. Children pressed their noses to the glass. Adults chuckled or frowned, and for a moment, even the poor could feel like participants in the future. But like everything in the Victorian city, there was a shadow behind the fun. Still, arcades provided a rare kind of freedom. They offered distraction without alcohol, warmth without work, and stories, however, crude in motion and color. And they were democratic. For one coin, anyone, child or elder, ragged or proper, could travel, predict the future, or test their courage. Even the noise was a kind of comfort. Clicks and bells and gears reminded people that the world, though hard and grinding, could still surprise them. You'd walk home afterward with your ears ringing and your heart slightly lighter. And as we leave behind the noisy, mechanical charm of the penny arcade, let us slip into something more silent, more haunting. The final chapter of our journey takes us into the eerie stillness of the Victorian death ritual, a world of black lace, stopped clocks, and the peculiar peace of mourning, where death was not an end, but a performance measured in crepe and time. Imagine the hush of a tightly drawn curtain, the ticking of a long case clock stopped by a gloved hand, a house not bustling with noise or laughter, but steeped in a heavy quiet, a mourning house, with expectation, with rules that governed who wore what, who was allowed to speak, and how long one should refrain from dancing, laughter, or even a cheerful color. In Victorian England, death did not simply occur. It arrived with ceremony. It blurred vision, stifled breath, and warned passers-by that the wearer belonged to grief. To mourn was not merely to grieve, it was to participate in a deeply embedded social ritual, one that reflected the values of the time, restraint, propriety, and the deep undercurrent of spiritual uncertainty that ran beneath it all. For women, mourning often began with a long veil of crepe doll scratchy, black fabric, that draped over face and shoulders. There were rules, so many rules. Widows were expected to wear full mourning for 2 years. The first year meant nothing but black, no lace, no silk, no embellish. The monarch herself set the tone, and the entire empire followed. Death was not hidden away, but captured, commemorated, and displayed. A black armband or a crepe ribbon on a hat might suffice. It allowed grief to be public, visible, and, in its own quiet way, respected. And among the very pious or very poor, wakes were held in close rooms, thick with candle smoke, prayer, and the smell of lilies. Their grief, though still expected to be solemn, was seen through a more practical lens. The world moved on. Colors crept back into wardrobes. Rituals faded. A language of loss. A sense that, even in despair, there could be meaning and beauty. And the black crepe, once a symbol of dignified grief, became a relic folded into drawers. Only after a suitable interval could half mourning be entered gray, mauve, or lilac, cautiously introduced like spring after a long winter. Men mourned too, though for a shorter time, 3 months for a parent, perhaps 6 for a spouse. To wear a piece of the departed woven into gold or sealed behind glass was to hold on to them in the most literal way. Poor families sometimes rented black horses and carriages, stretching their already fragile finances to ensure a respectable send-off. Mourning clothes could be borrowed, bought second-hand, or pieced together as best one could. Children wore mourning. So did servants. Even Queen Victoria wore black for the rest of her life after Prince Albert's death in 1861. Hair jewelry became a popular keepsake, braided strands of the deceased, rings, and locket. It was intimate, oddly tender. Funerals could be lavish or humble, depending on one's means. Photographs of the dead posed, dressed, sometimes appearing merely asleep, offered families a final glimpse. Even clocks were stopped at the moment of passing. Mirrors were covered to prevent the soul from becoming trapped. Mourning gave structure to chaos. It gave the living something to do, to wear, to observe. But over time, like all things, this rigid framework softened. Still, the Victorians' obsession with death gave us something enduring.